Welcome everyone to Thurgo and the Freak. I'm your host, the glorious League Freak, and I'm joined today by returning guest Elliott Richardson, Parramatta Eels fan, one-eyed eel guru. How's it going, Elliott?
Good, thanks, mate. Thanks for having me on again.
Pretty good. Now, last time we talked, it was kind of weird because we talked a little bit about the Eels, and we're like, their season's going to go one way or the other. It's either they're going to pull it together and they're going to get back on track and they're going to be a team to worry about, or they're kind of going to fade away. And I reckon it was maybe a week and a half later that Mitch Moses screwed his leg up and that was it. It was all over. What was that like for an Eels fan? Because you come into the season and you would have been like ready to rock and roll, get back into it. You know, the thing of like you got to have lost one to win one was there with the Eels. And it felt like it didn't get going for them. And then it kind of fell apart a little bit. It was really weird. It was kind of disappointing to see.
Yeah. But as an Eels fan, it's not entirely surprising. If you look at their 2002 season after 2001, it was a big drop-off. 2010, we didn't even make the finals. We were tipped as a premiership favourite that following season. And then, you know, this season, as opposed to 2022, again, a fairly decent drop-off in performance. Is a bit frustrating because they could put in some really good performances at times and then some equally as poor ones. And particularly in some of the games when we'd be in it, you know, particularly earlier in the season, went to Golden Point against Melbourne and got done. And it was a game that Melbourne weren't in front literally until Harry Grant scored the match winner. Now, up until then, we'd been in front or level with them the entire game. And funnily enough, you know, we beat Penrith the next week in Golden Point, which, again, you know, frustrating that against two of the premiership heavyweights, we get done by a try in Golden Point and then win by a point. And then we had other games this season where, like against the Dolphins, where we put on an absolute clinic in the first half and then clearly clocked off in the second half. And we were never really in trouble of getting run down. You put on, I think it was like 48 points or 44 points and a half. You're not going to lose that game, but for us not to go on with it was a bit disappointing. I know a lot of Eel fans were a little bit concerned about that kind of attention to detail, just the intensity going out of the side. But in saying that, there's also a bit of an understanding that I think we only had our top 17 available for one game this year. Yeah. And it was a game against Brisbane, and out of that game, Regan Campbell-Gillard did his groin, was out for like 8 weeks. And I think Junior Barlow got suspended, and I think might have been Sean Lane ended up doing his hamstring after coming back from an elbow or something a couple of weeks later. So it was like we got the 17 on the field for one game. They weren't particularly impressive, and within a couple of weeks, basically half our side had fallen apart.
Yeah, no, it was weird in that I think most people were expecting the Eels to get back into it after not the best start, but then it just was all over so quickly. And, you know, I mean, any team can have a season like that where it just doesn't work out for them. We've seen it a few times happen, but for the Eels, like you kind of expected them to be a top 3 side, maybe top 4 side at the lowest. And but when Moses, you know, got injured, and that was like the hammer blow, and it just really disappointing. But next season, how are you feeling about them going into next year? Because, I mean, they should be a lot better. With Hodgson retiring, they won't be like building around the expected game that he was going to bring them. And I think that's probably a positive thing for them. I think that they'll be at least top 6, and that's been pretty conservative. Where do you rate them going into next year?
It was kind of that, what version of Parramatta turns up. You know, on their day, they're a top 4 side quite comfortably. I think a big part of next season is that consistency. And we haven't mentioned it yet, but we did discuss it earlier in the year, but with Dylan Brown getting suspended out for 7 weeks. It was something entirely within his own control as well, which is the most frustrating thing. You can't do too much about injuries. You know, injuries happen in rugby league, but to have a guy, one of your best players, out for such a large chunk of the season entirely for something he did off the field that he had no reason to do and was utterly stupid in doing. So, to have him back, hopefully for a full season next year, Mitchell Moses, hopefully for a full season. I'd love to see Sean Lane back at full fitness. The good thing is he was back as per normal for pre-season. So no concerns there about his fitness because he's had, broken cheekbone or broken jaw, hamstring tear, elbow dislocation. Poor guy was through the ringer last year, and he's such a big part of our side as well. Through that left edge, he's defensively fantastic on the ball. He's such an awkward guy for the opposition to try and tackle because he's just got such a long limbs and he's got really good ball skills for a big guy. And he seems to just always get Dylan Brown's head into the game. He seems to really push Brownie hard and make sure he's always, on what's happening now and not worrying too much or clocking off. I think that the Josh Hodgson thing is interesting because from me, looking at the start of 2023, it was clear that the side was trying to work out how to play with him and he was trying to work out how to play with his teammates. I liked what he was bringing in terms of attack. His deceptiveness around the ruck was something that we hadn't really had for a while. And Reid Martin is very, very good at just getting the ball out, but he doesn't really probe markers. He doesn't open up space. And Hodgson was starting to do that for us. He seemed to be starting to work up a combination with Junior coming off the ruck and being able to target and isolate defenders. And he'd also, I think, pulled out a couple of short-range kicks. And I think there was also a couple of games where his kick pressure brought about a kick out in the full and gave us field position. It'd be interesting to see what our dummy half rotation's like next year with Joey Lussick and Brendan Hands, both NRL players. I'd like to see Brad roll with two dummy halves in a game, one on the bench, one starting, and to see how we go from there. I think that the way the game's being played now, it really suits to have that second dummy half who can spell your starter, or similar to how Penrith do in that sometimes you don't even start your starting hooker. He comes off the bench because you're trying to get them through that initial contact phase where they're not going to get gassed after 20 minutes and have to come off. If Penrith's not controlling the ball or they've got to do some defence early on, then they can get on and start getting a roll forward down the middle of the field. So again, it just really depends on what version of Parramatta turns up next year. I'm a little concerned about a backline depth. That was a big issue this year. It was an issue that wasn't addressed by recruitment and retention. They released Tom Opacek to go to England, which is fair enough. Look, he was offered a fantastic deal, a deal he wasn't going to get in the NRL. So, so be it. Go and get paid. Your career's short, so go and get paid. But to then not replace him and rely on a couple of project players, guys like Isaac Lumi or Arthur Miller-Stephen. And unfortunately, he's done his ACL, so he's out for next year.
Oh, wow.
And then we also had Zach Seeney, who, after bursting on the scene for the Tigers, hasn't really done much and unfortunately didn't really put his claim down in reserve grade for us. Again, we've kind of gone to market. We picked up Morgan Harper, and I know a lot of Manly fans are kind of glad to see him off the books. So again, I'm a little concerned by if we do get injuries or we do end up with guys in Origin squads. I think we're kind of lucky in that our back line isn't hugely a Blues orientated. I know Will Benassini is available and his name came up in the media this year. But Micah's not. I can't imagine he would ever get picked for New South Wales. Clint, we've all seen what's happened with him and Freddie Fittler deciding to play him for 3 minutes on the bench.
I feel
ridiculous.
Like we all just want Clint Gutherson to be just left alone by New South Wales for a while, just for him. Like, as you say, absolutely ridiculous what they've been doing with him. It's terrible.
Him and Nico Hines, I did not understand that. There was clearly no plan for them, how they're going to be used. They picked them because Freddie likes Clint. And look, Clint is, I think, similar to Dylan Edwards in that if you pick them for representative football, you play them at fullback or you don't play them at all.
Yeah, 100%.
Don't stick them on the bench. I mean, being fair, Edwards did play pretty well on the wing for Australia. But I think at Origin level, it's either you've got Tedesco as your fullback or you're going with a different fullback. You don't stick someone on the bench who can play across the back line like that.
Yeah.
That's not what you're looking for.
Yeah, it's Man, New South Wales, I'm so glad we've got a new coach in Mark Maguire, because the Brad Fittler thing, I think we're all sucked into it early on with his early success, but me and Andrew have ranted about his coaching for a while now, and just the way that he almost has hamstrung players in the team. And then, as you say, with those like just picking guys that he liked on the bench and having zero plan for them. Like, obviously no plan. It's just...
Well, he admitted that with Gutherson. He said, I don't know how I'm going to use him. I'm like, how can you pick a guy and then say that?
Yeah.
At least lie to the media going, no, we've got a plan for him. And at least it looks like you're thinking ahead.
Yeah. And then he quit because he didn't need all the hassle. It's like, I wish he could have quit about 3 years ago. It would have been fantastic. Yeah. Reid Marnie, he was your hooker. He did really well for Parramatta. There were a couple of times in big games where he just wasn't available, or he just was off his game a little bit because he was carrying an injury or whatever. And he goes to the Bulldogs on a big money deal and I don't follow either team, the Bulldogs or the Eels, but has what I would characterise as a catastrophic season for the Bulldogs, where all of the things that you kind of liked about his game, he didn't do. And then he added things like he would give away terrible penalties. His kicking game was abysmal at times, like game destroying for the Bulldogs at times. What was it like to watch him go and play for the Bulldogs and like have a season that bad?
Funny. Watching the first game he played against us was a home game for us at Combank, and our middle forwards terrorised him that entire game, and you could see it like in their face. They were going after him, and they were going after him hard. Like every carry from Junior or Reg was directed straight at him and was just challenging him. And there was a couple of times he backed out of the contact. He didn't want it. And then when he was coming into dummy half, particularly if the Dogs had field position, they were slapping at his arms. They were grabbing him. They were holding him just after he passed the ball. They were really getting on top of him. I was surprised when the Dogs named him in the leadership group, to be honest. He's never at Parramatta struck me as part of that leadership group, and he's still fairly young. Debuted at the end of 2018 and had his first full season in 2019, so he's still pretty fresh into first grade. And he's had as you mentioned, he's had a few injuries as well, which means he hasn't played the full suite of games available to him. On his day, he's one of the better hookers in the competition, but I think the game kind of has to fall his way for that to happen. He's not a type of hooker that will turn momentum your way. He's not a Harry Grant who's going to, pick out the tired A defender and get around him or find a bit of extra space around the ruck and go off for a 20, 30-metre dart. A lot of his best qualities require your forward pack to really do the business and get on top and then give him the space to do what he does. And if you watch the Bulldogs this year, they didn't have a forward pack. They had a lot of injuries. They really lacked an ability to physically match sides. And part of that's also on their recruitment, in that you go and spend that much money on Reid, Josh Addo-Carr, Matt Burton. Now they've gone and got Stephen Crichton from your blokes. You pumped all that money and pumped all that money into a lot of kind of headline grabbing players, but they're not the players that get in and get the job done for you every week. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You look at Penrith, and we will probably get onto this a little bit later, but so much of what they do is because of the likes of James Fisher-Harris and Moses Leota, and then Liam Martin on an edge. You need that work rate in the middle of the field to set your platform. And it's basic rugby league. The best sides do that. They have the ability to make sure that their hookers and their halves have the space they need. The Bulldogs have dug themselves a hole they're desperately trying to crawl out of. Whether or not they're doing it the right way, look, I don't think they are. Again, I don't think spending more money on your back line fixes your problems. They've got a pretty serious issue with their middle forward. If you pay attention to the media, they've got some issues with their culture regarding Raymond Fatala-Mariner. Less than a year ago, they named him captain. Now they're trying to get him out of the club, and they say that he's got a problem with the coaching staff. And look, Reid wanted to go there. By all reports, the offer from Parramatta was more than fair. The Dogs offered a bit more, and Reid decided he was going. So, if he wants to go deal with that, he can down there at Canterbury. I know we missed the finals this year, but we were a lot closer to making them than Canterbury were.
Yeah.
And something similar for Isaiah Papali'i as well. He's gone and got himself a wooden spoon a year after playing in the grand final. And again, similar thing. He went to a club that is really struggling for direction, struggling with their own identity, their own culture. The Tigers are probably more of a basket case than Canterbury. Just, you bring a guy in like Tim Sheens to do your review. He turns around and goes, well, appoint me as head coach. They appoint him for 2 years. He walks after a season. They appoint a rookie who's had 1 season as an assistant coach, retired like 2 years ago. His assistant is an old teammate who I think retired 3 or 4 years ago. You're looking at that club and going, that is a club in desperate need of a clean out from like top to bottom. They've thrown so much in terms of coaches and players at the problem. You go, no, your problem is your administration. And I can say this as a Parramatta fan because I've been through it.
Mm-hmm.
They need to clean that administration out. You cannot have a major sponsor on the board. That is a recipe for disaster. It almost happened to Parramatta. Pertek's CEO asked for a spot on the board. He was told no, so he pulled his sponsorship. That was one of the few things that Eels administration got right, was they said, no, that is a bad idea.
Mm.
And look, he went off and sponsored Brisbane, and they sponsored the old stadium. Look, that's fine. It monetarily wasn't great for the club, but for the long-term stability of it was. And then you look at the problems they've had with Justin Pascoe as CEO, and then the controlling stake in the board as well. Like, they've got that apparent review that's being conducted into the club that's supposedly independent. They've been trying to get John Coates on board or Barry O'Farrell as well. I don't think it's like a one person can fix everything. Parramatta ended up fixing everything because the state government stepped in and dissolved the board and installed an administrator, and it took us, I think, 3 or 4 years to get everything right. So it's not going to be a quick fix on that side of things as well. But as a fan of the Eels and watching what happened with Ice and Reid, I'm like, well, you guys kind of knew that going in. You chose to leave. That's your problem. The one player I really enjoyed watching last season was Barada Nyakware for the Warriors. And the Warriors to have such a great season, they were basically the team I was supporting in the finals. I wanted to see them go all the way. It's always great when the Warriors are playing good football, playing very different style of football to what's been successful in the past, under Daniel Anderson and Ivan Cleary. But it's been really effective for them. And it was clear that, they were all enjoying the footy. And Sean Johnson, honestly, I'm a bit gutted that he didn't get the Dally M, because I thought his consistency across the year probably should have earned him the Dally M over kind of a Callum Ponga having like a really good back half of the year. But
It's like a trend with the Dally M. It's like, you had half a good year with the Knights, Dally M, you get one. I wrote off Johnson. I was like, man, it's done. And it was sad because I always loved watching him play, but I wrote him off, and I was like, it must have really affected him those COVID seasons where they're away from their family and that. It just must have got him more than anyone. That's all I can think, because I was watching a guy that it was over with, and for him to come back the way he did, and it was that game against the Sharks where they went in at halftime and they were like, no, we're not gonna do this anymore, and they just turned their entire season around. And it was such a shame to see, because he had injury problems towards the end of the year. Because I'm like you, I always love seeing the Warriors in the finals, because it's almost like, I think it's what I like seeing is the way that New Zealand celebrates it. And it feels like they're bringing the celebration to everything else in the finals. Whereas a lot of other teams, they've been there, they've done that, they've got history of that and stuff. But when the Warriors are there, it just feels like it almost feels like there's a carnival atmosphere around it. It's hard to explain, and I love that. And yeah, it was cool to see them back. I hope that they back it up again this year. I think that they'll, at the very least, go close to the finals. But I would love to see them once again be like a top 4 side or something and just be rock solid in the finals all year, because I just love seeing them there. I just think that, it's good for the game and it's good to watch as well.
Yeah, well, they've got Roger Tuivasa-Sheck back as well. That should be good to watch.
Do you reckon they'll play him? I mean, part of me thinks that because they've got Chance Nickel-Klogstad at the fullback, and he played pretty damn well for them. He had a couple of lean seasons at the Raiders, and he went over there, and I was worried he was going to be one of those buys where, they brought back a Kiwi and it just didn't work out. It wasn't like that at all. He played really well for them. RTS coming back into the side, part of me thinks maybe they'll put him in the centres. Like, he's a big dude. He'd be able to handle the centres.
Yeah, I'd be sticking him in centres.
Yeah, but at the same time, if he starts showing that he's still got it, it's going to be hard not to, and he's going to get a chance at fullback, because Chance gets injured every so often, and it's going to be hard to get that fullback role off him again if he shows that he's still got the mobility, which we'll have to wait and see. And he's still got, that we've seen players go to rugby union and come back and they're missing that edge. I'm hoping that's not the case this time around with RTS.
Yeah. Let's hope he's still got probably a bit more speed than what Wendell Saylor had. But, Wendell came back and was still a very important part of the Dragons, and Matt Rogers came back and wasn't he great for the Titans?
Who would be the best? NRL. Who's the best one that's probably come back? I mean, you could say Sonny Bill Williams, but I think he had such a small role to play. It was easier for him to come back even than say Saylor and that, who they were starting the whole game.
Yeah. I'd say it was Matt Rogers, because he came back and he was playing for a new franchise that were trying to get themselves established, and he had the playmaking skill was still there, the vision was still there. He still had a fair bit of speed about him as well. And I think, when I even see Titans fans now, that because they had quite a good finish to the season, saying, we might have found our first set of consistent halves since Rogers and Prince. Yeah.
I guess he wasn't a world beater, but yeah, he was good and consistent for them, wasn't he? That's probably about the most you can ask for. Because, I mean, they come back when they were not super late into their careers, but late enough where, they're not going to be fleet of foot or anything like that anymore, I guess. Now, looking at this past year, and, we saw what the Panthers did this year. There was a lot of talk about the Parramatta Eels in the 80s, which must have been pretty cool to hear all of that sort of talk again, and hearing the Eels being brought up and what people thought about their run in the 80s. I don't like comparing teams from any of the eras, because I think it sucks, because you kind of grow up loving those teams that have achieved so much, and the only thing you can ever say is the Dragons were better than anyone, because they just were, and every other team around them that had runs, they were what they were, and that we should just applaud that run. But what were some of the things you heard during all of that talk that maybe stood out for you, or were there things that you loved hearing about? Like, I saw Peter Sterling a few weeks ago, and I don't know if he was at some sort of function, and he was asked about it, and he said, it was good to see Penrith do it, and they said to him, would you like to see them go 4-0? And he was like, to be honest, I'll be death riding them. And I thought it was hilarious, because it was honest. I loved it. And that stood out for me, and I was just like, oh, that's fucking great. Like that, he's been retired for bloody nearly 40 years now, but he's still got that competitiveness about him. It's so cool. Yeah. Is there something that stood out for you that people started talking about the Eels of the 80s?
It's probably still the respect a lot of them had for that group of players that played. A lot of people forget they actually made 4 grand finals in a row. They lost in 84. And Steve Edge retired after that season. He was actually an assistant coach to John Money in 86 when they won their 4th premiership. But he was the respect, the particularly from a lot of the Penrith fans, recognising the type of players that they were being compared to. For Cleary to be compared to Sterling, because again, very, very different eras. But I think a lot of people had forgotten that Peter Sterling had gone on the Immortals Tour in 1982 as the halfback for Australia, and they won every game on that tour to England and Europe. And then the likes of Michael Cronin kind of being, given his due as one of the greatest centres the game's ever seen. And it was actually funny, just recently, the family and I went down south for a holiday. We went past Gerringong, and I pointed out to my wife, I said, "Oh, it's Gerringong, that's the hometown of Mick Cronin. He still owns the pub down there, and he's just retired from coaching their country rugby league side." She's like, "So do you just navigate via rugby league players on the way down the coast?" And I was like, "Yeah, pretty much," because we went past Robertson not too much longer, and I went, "Oh, that's the home of Nathan and Ian Hindmarsh, and Ian Hindmarsh owns dairy." But it was also the like when I mentioned Gerringong, I said, Cronin was the last player who picked out of country rugby league to represent Australia. Like, that's how good he was.
Yeah.
In an era of virtual amateurism, they were being paid, but they had a second job. Not only was he not in Sydney, he was playing for a country team, and they went, "Yeah, you're good enough to represent your country. Sure, no problem."
Yeah.
And then, of course, the comparisons were made between Brian To'o and Eric Grothe Sr. Just, they're very different players, but kind of similar in the way that they are blockbuster. There was a discussion, like on Eels forums, more about, it always comes up, which players in the 80s, if you were building your perfect side, who would play where, and Eric Grothe Sr. always gets to run on the wing. The centres are always Ella and Cronin, and the halves are always Kenny and Sterling. Which is nuts. You look at that side and you go, that is insane. But you look at Penrith, and they're a little bit different in that your halves are quite clearly Cleary and Luai. Mm-hmm. But if you got into a discussion about your hooker, well, Appy wasn't there this year when they won their third. Not many teams can do that. They can lose their starting hooker and still be as good as they were. They had to change the way they played a little bit. They had to play a little more direct. They couldn't, pull sides apart as much through the middle. They had to rely probably a lot more on, I'd have to look at stats, but they seem to rely a lot more on that bash and barge from their props than they did previously. And James Fisher-Harris and Moses Leota were outstanding all season, and they were outstanding for New Zealand. And did Fisher-Harris, I think Fisher-Harris has won the Golden Boot. And he did today. More than deserves it. I can't wait till they change the origin eligibility so he's representing New South Wales. Because he'd probably be the one player that would take it personally against Queensland.
He probably would, yeah. I think that it's interesting because, it is kind of different in that because the salary cap's influence on the Panthers, and they, like the team that they won their first title with on this run compared to the team they've got now, there's quite a few like major changes there. And I know that there were changes to the Eels when they had their run, but there wasn't any, Kikau was just this giant, devastating player. I don't think you ever saw a giant, devastating player come out of the Eels team during that run. And it's because it's a different era. Just, it's not good or bad. It just was what it was. So it's kind of difficult to line them up against one another. But I think that the one thing, during the Pacific Championship, and Moses Leota and James Fisher-Harris are running out for New Zealand, and they're playing great. And I'm like, holy shit, they play for the same club, and it's my club. Like, how often has that ever happened? And I couldn't really think of a time where two test props who were at the very least, they're both in the top 5, I would say. I think there's a few other guys like Payne Haas, you toss him in there. Big Tino, if you consider him to be a prop, he's in there somewhere. But to have two of them on the one team is absolutely outrageous. And Cleary's difficult to sort of rate because of where he's only 26, and you kind of rate him against, everyone we're rating Cleary against now have had entire careers.
Yeah,
which it's hard, you know.
It's always difficult to make that comparison. Like I saw they were saying, Cleary, he's won 3 premierships by the time he's 26, and he's done this and he's done that. And it's very much like a case of, well, let's let his career play out, because who knows what will happen. But I think, again, a lot of people forget that I think Sterling had won 3 premierships by the age of 23.
Yeah,
like that.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like the passage of time goes, and you'd also say, I had this discussion with a Penrith fan at the gym recently, because he saw all the Eels gear I've got, gym shorts, all the stuff. But he was saying, as a Penrith fan, he's a great club halfback, but I'd really like to see him do it for New South Wales and in the way that Andrew Johns used to. Because Johns' legacy was built in Origin. Yes, he won 2 premierships in Newcastle, and he was the difference between Newcastle winning and losing. But Johns isn't an immortal if he doesn't have that. I reckon he's not an immortal if he doesn't have that 2005 series. To come in and do what he did is, it's still spoken about nearly 20 years later.
Yeah, at the very least, it was anybody that was going to question it had to shut up at that point. Like, I remember I got to see him play in the 95 World Cup, and probably ruined my high school sleeping patterns for forever. But I stayed up and watched those games, and he played some of the best games I've ever seen, and he was playing at hooker. And it was like you could see something was going on. You're like, what the fuck is going on here? This is unbelievable. And then, he sort of started building that club career. But as you say, it was more about what he was doing at Origin that people were seeing it. And I would agree. I think that was the full stop on his career, that where he come out, you were wondering what he was going to do in that Origin series in 05, and he put down a historic marker, and that was it. It was all over.
Well, I mean, let's even talk about the greatest, Wally Lewis. What's he spoken about? It's spoken about that he's the king of Origin, Brett Kenny. But, he's an immortal because of what he did in the Origin arena. And for a lot of those players, like particularly the older players, I think there's almost a split between Origin and Test football. Like Arthur Beetson, I think only played the one Origin match, but it was his, first of all, driving of the Origin concept, but also his exploits for not just East, but representing Australia, and I think being the first Indigenous captain of Australia in any sport as well was a big part of that, and his contribution to Aboriginal football was a big part of that too, because they always talk about, the impact that player has had on the game. So, I think you're right in that. We're talking about Cleary. He's 26. Let's see how the rest of his career plays out before we start tagging him as the greatest of all time. Because it was a similar thing with Cameron Smith. For a long time, he was just a good hooker, and the best hooker in the current era. Then it came, well, maybe he's the best hooker in the past 20 years. And then by the end of his career, when he's still performing at the highest of higher levels, and he retires from Origin, which not too many players get to retire from Origin. Most are dropped and then they just don't get picked again. For the vast majority of players, but for him to step away and just go, no, I'm done. And then similarly with his NRL career, just go, no, I'm finished. I'm going out on top. It was kind of towards those last couple of years of his career where everyone went, no, he's the greatest of all time. And there's obviously a little bit of recency bias there, but in terms of the way he changed the game as a hooker, again, you get to look at that now with kind of the fullness of time and look at who came before him, who's coming after him, and get to be able to judge where he sits in the historical record. But just on your point about when was the last time a side had two props who were kind of the best in the game, well, I don't know if you really want to bring this up, but it was probably Brisbane when they had their very questionable salary cap. In the 2000s when they got Petro and Webke.
So in my head, Petro in that era is still a second row, but he wasn't. He was a prop by then.
Yeah. I just recently heard
Sorry, go on.
I just recently heard a podcast, Webke. It was on James Graham's podcast, and it was interesting hearing him talk about that era with the Broncos and saying that, well, he was the bash and barge, just smash him up prop, and Petro was the guy with the silky ball skills and the nice footwork. And I'm like, all I remember is you two just terrorising New South Wales. And then you two, like, I love watching both of them play for Australia. Like, watching them in Ashes series and being able to just like the confrontations between them and the Kiwi forwards, when you knew the first 20 minutes of an Anzac test was going to be the toughest 20 minutes pretty much outside Origin every season, and the Kiwis had come at it as hard as they could, and you knew Webke and Petro were going to come as hard as they could as well. That's probably the last time you'd say that there was a club with a set of starting props like Penrith are at the moment, and Penrith have the nice, well, probably, maybe, I don't know, maybe they were looking to the future and going, well, if these two are any good, we're glad that neither of them are New South Welshmen. They can both play for the Kiwis and they're available all year.
You know what? There's there's definitely an element of that for sure, because, you know, like when we get to Origin now, and I think the other thing is too, like, we've been hitting it in the back, outside backs a little bit. And then because of the way the Origin selection's been and stuff, we've kind of been able to get one of our halves or both of them we've been able to hold on to in the first grade team. And on top of that, there's been some really good buys of like backups with Sullivan. You know, we had him last year, and Cogger this year, who, like, we don't win the premiership without Cogger in that grand final. So, and look, you win 3 in a row, you got to have luck at some point as well. Yeah. So there's been a lucky element there as well. But yeah, like, I think Webke, the two best props I've ever seen are Webke and Lazarus, and it was more Lazarus before because once he moved to the Storm, he was an older player by then. You know, his mobility had gone and stuff. But, you know, at his best, he probably reminds me a lot of Payne Haas, just in the, I mean, you know, for his era, the size of him in his era and his mobility for his size, he kind of was able to do what Payne Haas does now. And then the thing with Webke, I always used to say, was like, it's what he's doing in the 70th minute that makes him the best, because his runs in the 70th minute are the same as the runs in the first minute, and everyone else on the opposition team is stuffed, and he's still running through them. And I love talking about old players. Damn.
Yeah, I could talk about listening to Webke's podcast, he spoke about that, and that was his point of difference, because he was never the biggest bloke. He was never the fastest bloke. But he said, you know, his point of difference was he was always going to be the fittest. And he wanted to be able to, you know, be that guy taking that hard run in the 80th minute or making that cover tackle, because he knew that's what it was going to require him to be at the top. And he said he learnt that at the Broncos, and then learnt it again on his first Kangaroos tour, when at the Broncos he'd be the only guy going for that extra run every day. Then he said he went on tour with the Kangaroos, and it was every guy was going on that extra run. That's when he realised that to be at the top, that's what he had to do. Just to talk about some of those older guys now, which starts to age you a little bit when you're looking at Preston Campbell's son running around for the Titans, and then you turn to your kids and go, I remember when Preston used to play, and they go, shut up, Dad, get back to sleep.
It's when you start going like, oh, no, he's hurt. Is he going to be all right? It's like, oh, man, he's not my son. Yeah. Yeah, it's weird when you start seeing those things like, hey, look, I guess that, we're starting to get towards the next 10 to 15 years. There's going to be someone that's like someone's grandson who we saw the very end of their career. And it's like, nah, I don't like that at all.
Yeah, no, don't want to think about that. It was interesting what you said there with the grand final, and you don't win a grand final without a bit of luck. And I'm not sure if the luck was Luai having to go off and Cogger coming on. I think Cleary said at like full time, it was Cogger just allowed Cleary to do his thing. He didn't have to worry about anything else. He just, Cogger did his job, made his tackles, and Cleary was able to run the show.
Yeah, it was, what was he on for, like 25 minutes or something like that?
But that was when the comeback happened.
Yeah, and like, look, Luai, I think 90%, 99% of players maybe aren't even there and he played the week before. And I think that Broncos pack, it just was too much. It just eventually broke his body, and he goes off, and Cogger come on, and there is not one thing you could have said that would have made how he played any more perfect. It was just, he did exactly what he had to do when he had to do it. He got out the way when he had to get out the way. And yeah, as you say, like Cleary did say, he said, like, I knew I had to do something at that point. And tell me what you thought while you were watching that game, because I'm too close to it to be able to really talk about it in a sensible way. Like, all I can talk about how much I cried. I can talk about all sorts of stuff like that. But as a more neutral fan, what was it like to see that happen? And because it's not often you're watching a sporting event and you're like, holy shit, we're watching history. We're watching something that people will talk about unless something happens next year where someone comes back from 30 points down. Like, this is going to be something people are going to talk about for 10, 20 years, whatever. What's it like to watch that from a neutral point of view? And, like, did you write Penrith off like I did after Ezra Mann's third try, or did you always think, like, they were still in it?
Well, nah. My dad and I were watching it, and even when Ezra Mann scored, he was going, Brisbane need another try here. They're going to take their foot off the gas. They need another try. And he was right. And that's what happened. Brisbane took their foot off the gas a little bit, and Ivan Cleary put Leota and Fisher Harris back on. And I was looking at the stats. I'm working on a piece about this during the off season, and it was something like Penrith, their performance, like metrics wise, basically didn't change across the game. Like, if you were to split the number of meters they made, number of post contact meters they made, it was split into quarters, right? Pretty even across those. Whether it was the first quarter or the fourth quarter, they were pretty consistent. But in that final quarter of the game, Brisbane only made 10% of their post-contact and all-run meters. So they, by the time that final 15 minutes came, they were, wait a second, 20 minutes. Sorry, I was watching the NFL earlier. That final 20 minutes came, they had nothing left in the tank. They were gone. They couldn't. You could see they couldn't get off the line. Like, when Cleary rifled that 40-20, there was no one putting kick pressure on him. He had half an hour to boot that, and you've got to have all the skill in the world to do that under pressure. But, like, we've seen Cleary at times when someone gets up in his face, he doesn't quite get the accuracy you're looking for, and maybe he hooks that ball a bit more and it rolls out 22 meters out. He doesn't get the ball back, But it's all those little things where Brisbane, they had dropped a lot of ball. I think they only completed at 75% for the entire game. That last 20 minutes, they only had 4 sets and they only completed 2 of them. And Penrith were perfect. But that tells you how good they were at the back end of that game and how much that throughout the entire game, they were just coming at Brisbane continuously. And I think Brisbane were lucky to go into the break ahead, 8-6, because Penrith had the field position, they'd had most of the ball, and it was a case of, well, they should be a lot further ahead. But credit to Brisbane, they'd held on, they defended really well. I think there was a couple of times where it was a last-ditch tackle to prevent Penrith going over for a second time. But I don't think Penrith ever panicked, and I think they felt out on the field that so long as they just stayed in that match, stayed in that grind, the things would turn. And I think we've all seen it in footy games. We haven't really seen it in the grand final, but you always see it's that next try. And it was that Leota try that really kind of brought Penrith roaring back into that game to not only have Cleary make the break, but it's your middle prop sprinting up through the middle of the field where you'd expect Dylan Edwards to be, but it's your number 8 calling for the ball and crossing, I think that shows how much Penrith were coming home with the wet sail. And I mean, it was an unbelievable kind of clinic from Penrith to show you how to work your way back into a game, and a bit of a clinic for Brisbane on how to lose a game. They kind of lost their heads, they lost their composure, it shows you probably the youth in that side. I think what happened to them in that final 20 minutes is, I think, kind of what happened in that first half against Melbourne to Penrith a few years ago.
Yeah, definitely.
They didn't have the experience across the park that they needed to get things done, and Penrith did. Penrith had been there 3 times before. They'd won 2. They're like, right, we know what happens in the last 20 minutes. This is when we win a premiership again. And Brisbane just didn't have anything left in the tank by then. You could see it just in Payne Haas and Pat Carrigan, guys that would normally be able to, carry Brisbane forward, just had nothing left in the tank. And Penrith looked like they were running fresh. They were just running downhill. They were punching holes. They were giving their halves all sorts of room. I think you look at Cleary's killer try at the end where he comes off his left foot and goes back through the ruck. That was just tiredness of Brisbane. No one closed the gate. You should not have a gap where the ball's being played. You've got 2, sometimes 3 defenders there, and no one pushed across to cover that hole. And it shows you how gassed Brisbane were, but how good Penrith were to close up those points relatively quickly. And then by the end of it, that game could have gone for another 15 minutes, and Penrith would have banged another 4 tries on. Because Brisbane were gone, and they were superb, Penrith.
Yeah, it was like watching a supernatural event. It was kind of strange. I was actually thinking about it the other day where, and you can see it when you watch the replay where the weather changes in the game. It's just this small little thing. The weather changes and there's a breeze blowing across the ground, starts blowing stuff onto the field. And the game changed around that point, and it's just this really strange moment to see happen. And I think that's one of the things I love about rugby league is that it's always got something new to show you because it's such a dynamic game and there's so many differences in the players and the body types and the tactics and things like that. You haven't seen everything. There's always something new you can see. And, it was like, as I said, I think to Nadine when I talked to her after the grand final, it was like the monster was coming, and the monster was Penrith. And it's kind of, it's strange. I still can't believe they're my team. I remember I used to watch the Storm do stuff like this, and I used to love it because I love seeing a really good team do really good stuff, and that it's my team doing it. It just seems like I'd be really upset if I wake up from a coma and someone says it was all a coma dream or something. What do you think about the Panthers going into next year? Because they've lost Crichton, and Crichton in that last 20 minutes was about the player of the game himself. So he's going to be a big loss. I tend to think that the Broncos are going to be better for what they went through in the grand final. And I think that they'll win the minor premiership because I think that Penrith are going to have a lot more representation in the Origin team this year coming up.
How many more players you got that can play for the Blues? Well, at this rate, are we just dressing the Penrith in blue jerseys come middle of the year?
Could they do any worse than New South Wales have been going?
I have many thoughts on Penrith players in the Blues squad, but more so how Freddie was using them than the players themselves.
Mate, you're preaching to the choir. It's going to be nice to see halves that actually see each other during the game again, hey, for New South Wales instead of being parked out on the hash marks.
But you saw that in Game 3, right, when Cody Walker played so well. But it was because you watched that game and Moses was actually able to link up with him during the game, and actually give him the space to do what Cody Walker does so well. Because he doesn't play one side of the field for South. He plays both sides. You watch him play. He'll pop up on both sides of the field continuously. But, look, for Penrith next year, you can't write them off. They've won 3 premierships in a row, so thanks for trying to write them off and play the underdog card.
It's like, I'm not right next year. I'm not right off Penrith or the fucking Storm. I'm not.
All the Dolphins, right? Because you see it every season. Wayne Bennett's lost the magic, can't do it anymore. And you go, okay, the Dolphins didn't make the finals this year, but they were not the basket case anyone intended them to be.
No,
everyone thought they're just going to be cannon fodder. They're going to do nothing. They'll be lucky if they win 3 games. After 6 weeks, they were top of the table. And injuries and suspension got to them eventually.
And that's a depth thing. You can't build that depth in 6 months,
No. So, I think, they'll be better next year. Again, Melbourne, Craig Bellamy is kind of like Bennett at this point. You cannot write him off. You cannot write Melbourne off. He finds guys from nowhere and turns them into consistent first graders. Again, I think they had their own injury problems this year. I think at one point they were really scraping the bottom of the barrel for backs and I think for forwards. And they had a few injuries. Nelson, I think, was out for a bit. Christian Welch was out for a bit. I think Harry Grant was carrying injuries throughout the year. So it was very much one of those seasons for them kind of patching a side together. And they're that good. They've been that good for that long. Melbourne can kind of survive doing that. They're not going to thrive, but they can go deep because they kind of just, that's their culture. And they've been doing it for so long. They've been doing it for 20 years. Penrith, you've still got that forward pack, and that forward pack is still outstanding. I'm interested to see how the squad goes with the issues with Luai. I think that's probably more of an issue than Crichton. Like, even though Crichton's been gone for 12 months, and he's going to be a big loss in the back line, but I think you can always cover a centre leaving. I don't think you ever really see a side lose their potency or ability by losing a centre. Because you've still got, quite a good back rower in Liam Martin, and Zach Hosking put his hand up quite well last year. You've got Luke Garner. I think you've got the depth there in the Penrith junior system to find a good young bloke like Sunia Taruva is fantastic all year, and no one thought he would be that good. And it's the same thing, you lost Brett Naden, Charlie Staines, you lost Christian Crichton quite a while ago, Dallin Watene-Zelezniak. So it's kind of, I think if there's anywhere that Penrith are going to be okay, it's losing someone in the back line. They seem to always find a junior who's good to go. But I think it's more Luai. I think it's more that there's obviously a bit of a push and a pull there between the club and him. The comments from Cleary in the media about Luai not being a dominant half. And look, he's right. I think any club paying more than $1 million a year for Luai is nuts. But if the market determines he's worth that, then he's worth that.
Yeah.
But it's more, Luai's kind of been seen as that energetic presence around the side, seems to kind of stitch the dressing room together for Penrith. So I think it's almost, sometimes when you lose a player like him, it's not so much what he does on the field, because no disrespect, he's not one of the best top line 5'8" in the game that you would be losing. I think it's more the way he fits into the Penrith system and the way that he is within the culture of the squad is as equally as important to what he does on the field. So I think that's what they could end up missing if he does end up going.
See, I think that part of me thinks that if he was in the right team, I think that it would unlock his game a little bit more, because at Penrith he kind of has what he does on the field. Like his defence, you don't have to worry about. That's the first thing. Like most of the Panthers players, their defence is great. And I feel as though he has a wider capacity to be a better player. And the reason I say that is because of what we saw him do with Samoa at last year's World Cup, where he played all over the field. He was just unbelievable. It was crazy. He did everything. And I think that he has that game. But at Penrith, he doesn't have to do all that. And that's part of the thing about the great teams. Like you look at Craig Bellamy, he gets a player and he says, I want you to do this small task. And he turns you into a rep player doing that small task. I think someone like a Ryan Hoffman,
Yeah.
And so Luai has this smaller role with the Panthers. And I think that if he went to the right club, he could expand his role and he could show that he is like as good as just about any 5'8" in the game. But that club 100% is not the West Tigers.
No, do not go to the Tigers. I would, if the money was there, I'd be looking at the Dolphins. They are looking, Sean O'Sullivan has been good. But I think, Luai probably have a bit more pull up there as a leader in the halves department. I think Wayne Bennett would be, an ideal coach for him. Like he said, similar to Bellamy. Well, Bennett coached Bellamy and then gave him guidance at the start of Bellamy's coaching career. So it's no surprise Craig does that.
Yeah.
But, simplifying that role and putting the experience around Luai to be able to get the best out of him. You might be right in that Luai might have a bit of Mitchell Moses about him. Everyone knew Moses was talented at the Tigers, but he was clearly kind of hamstrung by Luke Brooks. Brooks wanted to be the dominant half, and push come to shove, he was winning that battle. Moses leaves, goes to a club that's looking for that dominant half, that's looking for a bloke to stamp his authority, and lo and behold, Moses plays fantastic for Lebanon, and then comes to Parramatta and becomes a Dally M halfback of the year and New South Wales halfback as well.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, it's more, I think, about how that relationship is managed within the club and within the playing group at Penrith. Because you can sometimes see that, some of his mates at the club might get a bit offside with the management to how that's been managed, because he's pretty close with Brian To'o. Obviously, Crichton's going, but I'd imagine he's pretty close with Cleary as well. So I think that's probably more the risk than anything for Penrith next year. I don't think they're going to have any problem with their actual squad, provided Fisher Harris and Leota and Yeo don't get injured. I think that's their three key players, because they rely so much on them to do all that work in defence. And then in good ball, they're so reliant on them to ensure that they get the space for Cleary and Luai and Edwards to play off.
Yeah, and I think if Jerome Luai, because there's been talk about he could go early and be at the Tigers next year, I think that a lot would have to go right for that to happen. I can't imagine the Panthers are going to allow that to happen unless they get a really, really nice deal out of it. And if the Panthers are getting a really nice deal out of it and I'm the West Tigers, I don't do it, because I kind of wonder why the Panthers are so keen on doing it at that point. But I could see if Jerome does end up leaving the Panthers, and look, if I was talking to him, I'd say, dude, take the money. It is huge. You're going to be one of the best paid players in the game, If that does happen, I could see where the Panthers look to change their attack a little bit, where maybe they look to bring in a big, hard-running 5'8", a bigger dude, rather than the smaller, more creative player that Luai is. So that would be interesting to see. And I don't know their lower grades as well as other people do. But it'd be interesting to see if they've got someone tagged in the lower grades. I know Cleary has a younger brother who apparently is very good, but I think it's a little bit early for him. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that does work out, because there's you don't want to upset the apple cart when things are going so well, but it's almost forced upon them. I was pretty pissed off about the way that Ivan Cleary talked about Jerome Luai's contract situation. I thought it was gross. I thought that a club coach shouldn't be saying those sorts of things in public about a player that's looking to secure his future. I could understand if Jerome Luai was absolutely filthy, because I know I would be. Yeah,
to talk a player down like that, who's still your player. It's not like he's signed elsewhere, and it's kind of, I can understand where Ivan's coming from. He's obviously feeling a bit let down that a guy he's had since he was a teenager has decided to dump him for someone else. But yeah, I was surprised Cleary took that approach with Luai. And like I said, that could cause a rift within the squad a little bit. But again, you've won 3 premierships in a row. I don't think that with the kind of gravitas that Cleary now would demand, I'd imagine that you get too many people pulling against him. It'd be a bit different if it was an inexperienced coach in his first couple of seasons, where you can kind of go, look, what have you done in the game? Why should I listen to you? It's like, well, this bloke's won 3 premierships in a row with you guys. You disagree with him at your peril, because there are players bashing down the door to come to Penrith, or bashing down the door to take the next step from cup or lower grades into first grade.
And he's like Cleary, I guess, is really close to. I don't think people talk about him in the obviously the Bennett Bellamy sort of step up, but he does a little bit more, and especially when you add what he did at the Warriors, because to think that the Warriors had him and they let him go because they didn't want to give him a long contract still blows my mind. If he does a bit more with the Panthers, and you sort of look at what he's done with the Panthers, and then you look at what he did with the Warriors, and you start to have to think about him in a different way, which is really weird when you think about at some point someone at Penrith, Phil Gould, got rid of him, said he wasn't the guy, and
he was tired. They had to go appoint Anthony Griffin, who's done nothing as a coach.
So, to be fair, everyone gets tired from time to time. It's really strange to see what we're seeing. One thing I did want to talk to you about today, because we've had the chance to just talk about anything. The NRL is a really close competition, and for the most part, teams go up and down the ladder unless you're the West Tigers. And everyone gets their chance. Normally,
no finals for you.
Yeah, no finals for them. Everyone in a 5-year span can normally point to one team that went pretty damn well, unless you're the West Tigers. Now we've got a team that's won 3 straight, and we haven't had that for decades. Do you think that having a team like that has won, and to be fair, it's only 3 straight, so it's not like we're talking about a decade or anything. But do you think that to have a team like that everyone has to aim for year after year is a good thing or a bad thing for the competition overall? Or do you think it is far better to have just teams going up and down the ladder, you're like on a yo-yo basis? Or do you think it's better to have those teams where you got to aim for them, you got to try and you got to slay the dragon almost?
I'd be more concerned if we were like the Premier League and the spending was uncapped and you had this almost fictional financial fair play thing. I think for Penrith, the fact that the majority of their players in those squads are homegrown is such a great thing for rugby league, because you can't accuse them of buying premiership. The jokes have consistently been about the Roosters, and I don't think they're anywhere near that right now, given how they've hemorrhaged players through retirement and leaving and all that business. But there was once upon a time, I remember seeing their squad was 13 players. Their starting team were all representative caliber and had all represented either their country or their state that season. They're not the Brisbane of 2000s or late 90s. They're not Melbourne that was cheating the salary cap. Their first, the first grand final and that first premiership, vast majority of their players were on quite, I would say, normal sized contracts. So you can't say that they bought a premiership, because they've developed those players and created that premiership winning side. I think having a side that is up there like Penrith is forces other teams to innovate. You can't copy them because they're the best at it. There was a really good quote a couple of years ago from Trent Robinson saying that basically rugby league coaching is too full of rugby league guys. Basically, we don't think outside the box enough. We're not looking at those pathways for coaches. We're not looking at education for those coaches that are coming from a background that's other than playing, basically. You look at the vast majority of NRL coaches right now, and they all came through a junior rugby league system with their club or with another club. Like Cleary was a record point scorer at the Warriors or something, wasn't he? For a while. I think he was. Yeah.
Even
Trent Robinson played first grade. Brad Arthur was in Parramatta's junior system. Actually, got told to be coached by Roy Simmons. So.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, he got released by Parramatta. Went to Penrith. And Royce basically said, look, you're not going to be good enough to make the NRL, but I reckon you can give coaching a go, and got him set up in the bush. Yeah. So that's where he got his start. Craig Bellamy, all that time at Canberra, even Wayne Bennett, he played Brisbane Rugby League and represented Australia, I believe.
Yeah, he did.
They've all got that kind of, ex-player. If I didn't play at the highest level, I played kind of one under it. I've got all these contacts in the industry, and I get it. It's a contacts business. a lot of coaches, you know, they get their assistant coaching jobs because they know a guy, knows a guy, gets them a gig. But with what Trent Robinson was saying is, you know, rugby league has stayed. Yeah, everyone likes to say, oh, it's different to the way it was played 3 years ago. And I'd say, well, no, I'd say the real difference probably occurred about, you know, 10 years ago. The last 10 years or so, the way the game is played is very, very similar. There have been small adjustments made here and there, but there's been no great innovation from the way that, you know, teams attack. You know, they make changes when they're forced to by the rules. You've seen the way that teams have become so good at running their block plays so that, you know, you run at the inside shoulder of the defender or you run at the gap so that you don't get called for an obstruction, or the way that sides contest for the ball, you know, is very similar. They just put their blockers in a better position so they don't get called for a penalty. And wrestling hasn't disappeared. It's just teams have become better at it because they're not trying to wrench a guy's head off. It's not as obvious, but if you've watched a bit of MMA, you know what they're doing. Right? You see the guy grabbing across someone's body and grabbing hold of his wrist so he can't stand up. No one's looking at it going, oh, the ruck's a bit slow. It's like, yeah, that's because the guy holding the ball physically cannot stand up under his own body weight because of the hold that the defender has on him, but it looks so innocuous you can't see it. But, you know, I don't think, you know, even when Brisbane were as good as they were, and even when the Roosters had won 2 in a row, I didn't really get exhausted by it because the nature of the salary cap means teams will come down and teams will come up. You know, we've seen that from the Roosters. They were so good in 2018, 2019, and then they've had a slow decline since then. And part of that is because they've had to release players. Other players have retired. They've, you know, basically come back to the middle of the pack. And I think that will eventually happen with Penrith. You know, more and more of those players will either get older. Some of them might become a little bit more complacent, going, I've won 3 premierships. What am I doing this for? Why am I killing myself in the 75th minute again? I've done what there is to do. And I think you've seen that with some of the guys who've left. You know, Api Korosaus towards the end of his career, he's won a couple of premierships. He's won 3 now because of the one with Souths. And he's kind of gone, I could stay with Penrith, but I could go take the money elsewhere. And right now the money seems good.
And like you can't begrudge any of them at that point. It's like, I mean, some of these guys have had careers worth of winning already, and so when they take the money, it's like they could retire today and say, I had a really fucking good career. You know, you can't blame them at all.
No. And because rugby league, the competition itself is so competitive, there's always going to be that movement at the top. You know, there's always going to be, like you're seeing Brisbane 2 years ago, cannon fodder. This season, one of the top sides in the competition, and they didn't necessarily buy their way out of it. Yes, Adam Reynolds is an amazing pickup, and South should be kicking themselves over that decision to release him. You know, they're scratching around trying to make finals, and Reynolds is playing in another grand final and having nearly a career year for him. He was fantastic all season. But then you also see other sides, the way that they drop off, and it takes some time to get back. Like you could say Souths have had that as well recently. They were really good, you know, 5-6 years ago. They were one of the benchmark teams, and they've come back to the pack a little bit. The nature of this game is so attritional that teams do come up and go down, and I don't think there's any real issue with having a team like Penrith. And I mean, they were talking about it in the lead up to the grand final, that they were trying to do something that hadn't been done since the 1980s, and it was giving them something to aim for. And, you know, it's probably, it's a really funny coincidence that they did it literally 40 years to the year since Parramatta won their 3 in a row, 81, 82, 83, 21, 22, 23.
It's like, I guess, we've talked about. It's weird because I talk about the Panthers and I'm like, am I talking about my team too much? But it's like, what am I supposed to do for, like, not talk about this historic thing that we're all watching happen right now? I guess the thing with Penrith is that for most teams that have done what they've done so far, they're normally in their 30s. For the most part, these Panthers players, I think the elder ones are like 28, 29 now. You've got Cleary's 26. They've got a bunch of like early 20s players in their team, especially in the backs. like you would normally be worrying at the just getting worn down by what they've played a lot of football over the last 3 or 4 years now. And it probably helps that they're younger, that they can get through that a little bit better. But it's eventually going to take its toll, and eventually there's going to be a team out there that just comes out of nowhere, and it's like, oh man, look at this team, and that's one of the great things about rugby league. Once upon a time, Clive Churchill retired. It eventually everyone's time is up, and eventually, like I like to think about when Danny Badiris had a year off touring for Australia because he needed a break, and his place was taken by Cameron Smith, and we all know how that turned out.
Yeah.
Eventually someone comes along who's just younger, and they've watched what you've done, and they might have improved 0.5%, and that 0.5% is a thing that makes them basically better than what you're doing right now. And it's going to be interesting to see when that team comes along, because a lot is going to have to go right for that team. And I think Brisbane is so close to that. Like, they're so close. But a lot is going to have to go right for that team. And then they're going to have to overcome this, like, weird, I don't know what it is about Penrith, where they just, it's like they've got some magic potion that they've poured on themselves where they just refuse to lose. But it's going to happen. And that team that does beat Penrith, they are going to be a bloody good team. And, it's going to be interesting to see what that team does, because I thought Brisbane had what it took. But watching that grand final, and it's like, man. And look, Penrith might come out next year, finish in 7th place, and it all just finishes with a whimper. And because sometimes that happens with these sorts of clubs. But I tend to think it's going to be the other way, where almost like that 2021 semi-final against the Storm, the Penrith versus the Storm, and they had like this gigantic battle, and Penrith finally slayed their dragon. I hope it's like that for the Panthers. I hope whoever comes along has that moment, because that would be a really special moment for rugby league, I reckon.
Yeah, to have that side that comes in and announces themselves like that. I mean, I'd like it to be Parramatta. There's a storyline there, with the history between the two clubs in the past few years, with Penrith basically winning all the finals matches and Parramatta basically winning all the regular season matches.
Yeah.
I'd trade all those regular season wins for that 2022 grand final.
Yeah.
But
imagine if they played in the grand final next year, right? And it's the Eels trying to stop the Panthers winning 4 in a row. That would be like, ugh.
Oh, mate, I'd be asking if we could go back 40 years and clone Ray Price.
Yeah.
It was, I don't know where I saw it, but it was recently. There was a clip about the 81 grand final that popped up somewhere. Mm-hmm. And someone basically, they're talking about Ray Price before the 81 grand final. And he basically said, look, if we don't fucking win this, we're never going to fucking win one. Mm-hmm. And that was just his attitude. And yeah, okay, they ended up winning those 3, and he finished his career with another premiership. But I've had that discussion with a few Eels fans about what it would be like to actually break that drought again, because it'd be almost as groundbreaking as 1981. They'd finally get that monkey off the back.
Mm-hmm.
Even if that year it was against Newtown, considering that the previous clubs were Manly and St George, who we played in grand finals, which would have, if you're looking for a storyline, that would have been a great storyline, but it didn't happen like that. It'd be amazing if again it came down to a grand final between Parramatta and Penrith. I can't see Penrith fading away,
mm-hmm.
going out meekly or sliding down the ladder, unless they had some kind of terrible injury crisis or suspension problem where, they lost a good chunk of their forward pack and, they couldn't, it was a long-term issue, because Penrith's already shown if they miss a guy for 3 or 4 weeks, it doesn't really impact them, they'll keep going. But like you said, there's also that they've played a lot of football in the past 3 or 4 years, and sometimes it just begins to get wearing. Is it in that knockout final? Do they drag themselves back off the canvas again, or are they unable to finally keep it over them? And now you've particularly got probably Brisbane coming hard at them. They've got the youth in their squad, but they've also got that experience now.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said at the start of this, if Parramatta get their act together for an entire season, they can put together a season like that as well, where they start looking like they're running downhill and they become hard to stop. So it'd be, again, a very, very competitive season next year. If anything, 2023, I think, brought a lot of it back to what I would say is normal rugby league after the previous few years of that almost rugby league on steroids, which for me, a lot of those games weren't enjoyable. I don't want to watch a team getting blown up by 30 points every week.
No.
Even if my team is the one putting on the 30 points, because it's nice for you for and against, but that when it comes finals, you're not going to win by 30. It's a lot tougher than that. So you want to see how good your team is in those pressure moments.
Look, I've said through even before the run, when it looked like Penrith had a good young squad that they had together, I liked seeing them tested. I liked seeing them down and out and having to drag themselves back in, to the point where it was like I was being sadistic about it, where it's like, I want to see these guys hurt and see what they do with it, and a lot of those sorts of games made them the team team can get through those tough times and learn, because I feel you've got to learn to not fold,
Yeah.
And all of that comes from having experience around you of players that can show you, not to break, so, it's, and I agree with you that the footy that we saw in 2021, I think, was the worst year I've ever seen a footy.
It was completely lopsided. I think there was a stat that it was like the most lopsided season in recorded history.
Yeah.
And that includes the early 20s and 30s when you had sides dropping in and being promoted and 35. I think the Bulldogs got done by 80 twice that season, and 2021 was still more lopsided than that.
Yeah, and it was horrible. It was really horrible. And I agree with you. I thought this season was a pretty damn good year, especially if you take the Tigers out of it. Even the Bulldogs had some pretty good games.
Well, the Tigers even put 60 on the Cowboys at one point.
That was weird, hey?
Yeah, and then the Cowboys virtually reversed that scoreline later in the season.
Yeah, I think that I was looking at that not long ago. 72 points, I think it was, something like that.
Yeah.
You know what I would like to see though is someone do the point a minute. That would be pretty cool. That's the one thing I would like to see. I
have been to a game with 80 points scored.
What was that?
That was 2003 Parramatta versus Cronulla. The Eels won 74-4, and Shane Hayne, I think, was the referee.
Yeah.
And he went nuts that game. He sent off Danny Nutley.
Mm.
Then he binned Paul Gallen.
Mm-hmm.
I think he sent Greg Bird. And I think there was another bin in there, because at one point we were playing 9 or 10 players. And there's a try where Nathan Kalis cuts through from 50 metres out and there's no one in front of him. And Nathan Kalis runs 50 metres untouched to score it. Jamie Lyon scored 4. Yeah, he's got the club record. 4 tries? 5 tries? 5 tries in that game. Still holds the record for the club. But yeah, it was an unbelievable thing to watch. And the thing is, that all happened in the second half. Parramatta were up by 20 or 30 at half time. And then Shane Hayne went ballistic. It was after he sent Nutley off, Gallen verbally abused him. So that's when he got binned, and then it just compounded from there. It's on YouTube. The second half is on YouTube if you find it. It's an hour, and there's a section there where Shane Hayne just goes nuts and just starts binning and sending players. And not one of them is a Parramatta player. These days, you sometimes see a square up. Nah.
Yeah.
Just absolutely kneecapped Cronulla. And yeah, it was left them with like I think 9 players at one point, and I think 10, maybe 11 players to finish the game. It was absolutely unbelievable to watch that. But
we're gonna have
different to this season in that, you know, Parramatta was playing like 10 blokes, whereas the Cowboys were playing a full 13, and they're still piling points on.
I watched. It wasn't the whole game. I think it was the game highlights, and it was as though you got. It was really weird. It was like you got, instead of having a defensive line, it was like the Tigers were just sprinkled across the last 40 metres of their zone, and it was really strange to watch it. But, you know, at least Benji Marshall's been an assistant coach for 6 months leading into next year, so that's going to be good. You know, one thing... Sorry, go on.
There's a definition of being mentally checked out in that game.
Oh, yeah, 100%. 100%. And look, that's the folding thing. If you learn how to fold, good luck getting out of it. And I think that's what we see with the Bulldogs. I said this in a podcast about 2 months ago now, I guess it was. I don't think even in rugby league you can tank seasons. And obviously we don't get draft picks or anything, but it just through poor management. I don't think you can have like back-to-back really terrible seasons and it not affect you going forward. And I think that's what we're seeing with the Bulldogs. I think we're seeing that with the West Tigers, obviously. And, you know, you see other teams like the Dragons are really struggling getting out of that themselves. I think the Titans for a long time have. And look, the Titans next year, they could be a finals team or they could just be 10th. And I think a lot of that has to do with, you know, they learn to fold when the going gets tough. I just think that you can learn to fold or you can learn to pull it together, and it's really clear which teams are which when you watch the Premiership over a whole season. You know what? I'll let you go in a second. You know what you and me should do for a podcast one day is have an entire podcast about the 2001 Eels team. Who
I don't know if I'm going to do that to myself.
we can stop before the finals, right? But the regular season 2001 Eels team is one of the greatest teams ever assembled. Statistically, one of the best teams of all time. And like a lesson in so many of the rugby league lessons that you get, you know, taught. I mean, I remember at the end of that regular season, Brian Smith taking a player off the field so they could learn to defend with 12 just in case, you know? Like, they were that prepared.
I to this day will still watch highlights of that 2001 season. And Brian Smith, for me, just, like, tactically so astute. And I think probably to his detriment towards the end of his career. Like, he was just... I think sometimes he needed the players around him that could execute what he was thinking. Like, you look at that 01 side when you've got Jason Taylor as your halfback, you know, a really smart halfback who knows what's going on and, you know, some experience, but also a lot of really youthful enthusiasm through it. So I think Nick Campton a couple of years ago, I think it was still when he was with the Daily Telegraph, wrote basically that the Penrith side of 2021 or 2022 had taken everything that Brian Smith had rolled out in that 2001 side and turned it into that year's like blueprint. Like Smith basically invented the tram track running second rowers. The way that they were like Nathan Hindmarsh was an attacking weapon. He was not a workhorse back then. He was an attacking weapon.
He was an amazing wide running second row. Not wide running second rower like we see a lot today. Like, he was a little closer to the ruck, but he was amazing at that job. Maybe a bit like Martin, more like Martin.
Well, actually, Campton actually made the comparison with David Fafita in that you actually watch young Nathan Hindmarsh, and because of the size difference, he was bigger than a lot of the guys he was running at, and he just bumped guys off tackles. And he had a really good offload. He was a lot. I mean, he was still pretty fast towards the end of his career, but he was as fast as a back then. Yeah. So he had the speed, he had the footwork, he had the motor to do what he needed to do, and you know, there was the kicking game of Jason Taylor to pin teams deep, put pressure on them. And then their forward pack could be pretty brutal at times as well. You had a really crafty hooker in Brad Drew, and then off the bench you had PJ Marsh. I love PJ Marsh. I will talk about PJ Marsh for hours because he had 2 stints with us, and both of those stints were outstanding. Both of those stints we won minor premierships.
He would be one of those guys if you could put him in a time machine and bring him into now and say, do exactly what you do. Just do you. He would do what he did and he would still be just as good.
Yeah, him and Craig Wing, because at one point they were the 2 utilities in Origin. It was PJ Marsh off the bench for Queensland and Wing off the bench for New South Wales. And PJ, just the skill set he had around the ruck, like he played in the halves, but I loved him at dummy half. And that working in tandem he had. And then, you've got Isaac Yeo, who's the ball player. And then back in that 2001 squad, I'm pretty sure our lock was Daniel Wagon, who came to the club as just a big 5'8".
Yeah.
And Brian Smith's like, nah, I need a middle ball player. You're playing that role, And, look, as you can tell, I probably love to talk about 2001 side. We'll stop before the grand final because we all know that. And I still have nightmares about that. It's any person who knows me, they mention Parramatta, they'll eventually bring up 2001. And I'll cut the discussion short there.
It's another one of those things where rugby league just, man, I won't. All right.
It's the one time I will agree with someone when they say rugby league should be first past the post, and I'll go, for that season, yes. I love a grand final. I love watching a grand final. But God damn it, when you play a season that long and you're the best team in the competition by a country mile, and then you lose because of one game, is frustrating. But I do not want to sound like an Indian cricket fan right now talking about the World Cup, so I'll shut up.
Look, that's one of those grand finals where it's like I would never begrudge an Eels fan being upset about that one. In the same way, I would never begrudge a Norths fan for just being upset about the entire 1990s. And the one thing they had in common, I think, was the one thing they had in common, and it was Jason Taylor. And I honestly believe you could have picked fucking 10 of the halfbacks in the NRL at that time, they would have been fine Eels, but they had Jason Taylor, who was the absolute epitome of a great halfback till the finals. And then he fucking fell apart, and he held it together longer than he ever did before in that Eels team, and then it fell apart, and it's like, oh my God. And it also helps when on the other team you've got like fucking Andrew Johns in his peak,
There was like, one team that was going to do it, like upset someone. A team with Ben Kennedy and Andrew Johns, that's a team that can do it to you.
I fucking hate that I do this to you sometimes. I'm so sorry. I do not mean to do this. Oh shit. Well, hopefully this time next year we're talking about something that the Eels have done where it's like, holy shit, can you imagine that? And you can just be like, dude, that's fucking amazing. Can you believe it? And stuff like that. And I can be sitting here going like, yeah, it's fucking great. And being like, oh, how about Penrith? They far out. No one saw that happening. So, because it's like after that the grand final last year, I wasn't having you on. I wasn't doing that. But, then I bring you on and we talk about 2001. What a fucking dickhead. I always love having you on. We'll have you on again in the off season. We'll talk about something completely random. I'll toss something up to you. I won't tell you before the podcast. I'll just say, how about this? It's because it's always great having you on and just talking about general footy stuff and how the season's going and what you think of other teams from an Eels fan's perspective. It's always great.
Fantastic, mate. Looking forward to it.
Where can we find you, mate? And also give a plug to One-Eyed Eels.
Yeah, you can, if you're looking for your Eels discussion, oneeyedeal.com. Still pretty busy over the off-season. Plenty of chat now that pre-season started. And we've got, I think, the full squad's back. So there's a lot of discussion about what the top 17 will look like come round one. Then you can also check out, if you're on YouTube, go check out the Extended Bench. That's been on hiatus, but it was back this week. So that's a weekly look at basically whatever I decide I want to chat about for rugby league. And this week, it was a look at the start of next season being in America. Very topical.
Go and listen to the pod. I won't ask him. Go and listen to the podcast and find out about what he thinks about that one. All right. By the way, on One Ideal, is there something that's dominating the off season right now? Because I know that every so often on these forums there'll be something that is just the thing that becomes the off season. Is there something that is the off season on One Ideal at the moment?
It's very much recruitment and retention. It's probably, that does numbers every year. But, again, this season, particularly after the year we've had, there's that. And then there's also discussion about, I think, just, the drought's been so long, about what happens if next year doesn't work out. With the two main comments, which is probably pretty normal for a Parramatta fan.
Look on the bright side. Nathan Brown's gone. Everything is going to get better.
To his credit, he was head of junior pathways, and they won SG Ball and made a Harold Max grand final. So maybe his niche is not in the NRL coaching ranks. Maybe it is junior development. Junior
footy, yeah. Well, hopefully it turns around at the senior level as well. It doesn't need to turn around. You just need some fucking injury luck. It's just injury luck and a bit of suspension luck, and because that last year wasn't a real. It wasn't where the Eels really are. We know that they're better than that. Man, when Moses went down, it was just like that was it. It was just one too many. Anyway, thank you for joining us. Thank you for everyone for joining us, and we will catch us again soon.